Night fell over Tehran on the early morning of February 28, 2026, with a haunting silence that preceded a moment that would tear the history of the Middle East asunder. In a mere 50 seconds, a lightning strike involving advanced bunker buster munitions reduced the most fortified underground command complex in Iran to a pile of smoldering rubble. This was no ordinary airstrike. It was a surgical decapitation of the Islamic Republic's central nervous system, claiming the life of Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei alongside dozens of high-ranking generals from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. At Mar-a-Lago, President Donald Trump and his military advisors watched the satellite feeds with bated breath, believing they had just delivered a checkmate move to end 4 decades of hostility. However, while Washington prepared a victory speech, a seismic event occurred outside the reach of American intelligence. An Arab nation, long considered a cornerstone of the United States' strategic alliance in the Gulf, did not call the White House to offer congratulations. Instead, they made their first diplomatic contact with the newly appointed leadership in Tehran. This shockwave traveled faster than the physical impact of the bombs. Diplomatic sources revealed that this Arab state proactively reached out to Iran's Provisional Leadership Council before the dust had even settled at the Pasteur complex. This action was immediately perceived as a stab in the back to the Trump administration, a blatant betrayal of the commitments made under the Abraham Accords and various regional security frameworks. Washington was left in total shock by the reality that the very ally they had spent billions of dollars to protect had chosen to extend a hand to the enemy at the exact moment the United States believed Iran had been neutralized. The American calculation of a domino effect leading to a Venezuela-style regime change crashed against a brutal geopolitical reality. Iran did not disintegrate. Instead, its 4-tier succession system activated instantly, bringing even more hardline figures to the forefront of power. Inside American command centers across the Middle East, the atmosphere turned from triumph to extreme tension. While the United States and Israeli forces continued to pound over 500 targets across 9 Iranian cities, fresh intelligence reports suggested that this treacherous Arab ally had opened a secret back channel for separate security negotiations. They were not just calling, they were proposing a non-aggression pact with Iran's new leadership in exchange for a cessation of the missile and drone strikes that were currently ravaging oil infrastructure and commercial airports across the Gulf. This represented a dangerous strategic shift, signaling that regional allies no longer trusted the American security umbrella to shield them from the full scale of Iranian retaliation. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz and the threat of turning American bases into graveyards forced these nations to prioritize their own survival over their loyalty to Washington. The actions of this Arab nation were not merely a diplomatic gesture, but a message to the world that the era of American hegemony in the Middle East was facing its most severe challenge. President Trump, who had built his platform on the strength of negotiation and military might, now faced a profound crisis of confidence within his own coalition. Washington realized that while they could eliminate a leader, they could not eliminate the complex web of geopolitical and economic interdependence in the region. The bitter truth was that while the United States sought to isolate Iran, its allies were finding ways to coexist with a wounded but vengeful nation possessing a massive arsenal of ballistic missiles. This betrayal marked the beginning of a dark and unpredictable chapter in the epic fury conflict, where the lines between friend and foe were blurred beyond recognition. The atmosphere inside the White House Situation Room shifted from a feverish intensity to a cold, suffocating silence as the realization of the diplomatic betrayal set in. For decades, the United States had operated under the assumption that its Gulf allies were locked into a security marriage of necessity, one where American firepower was the only thing standing between these monarchies and an Iranian regional hegemony. But as the decrypted transcripts of the secret call between Riyadh and the newly formed Iranian Emergency Council began to circulate, that assumption shattered. President Trump, according to internal sources, was visible in his fury, demanding to know how the most sophisticated intelligence network in the world had failed to see this pivot coming. The shock was not merely that a call was made, but the tone of the conversation itself. It was not a warning or a condemnation. It was an olive branch extended over the smoldering ruins of Tehran. The Arab leadership had reportedly expressed their desire for a regional solution for regional problems, a phrase that, in the world of high-stakes diplomacy, is a direct rejection of Western intervention. Outside the corridors of power, the global economy began to reel from the implications of this strategic decoupling. Within minutes of the news leaking to the financial markets, the price of Brent crude oil surged by over 30%, surpassing $150 per barrel. Traders and analysts watched in horror as the nightmare scenario of a total energy blockade began to materialize. The Iranian Navy, despite being heavily targeted in the initial 50-second strike, had successfully deployed thousands of smart mines across the narrowest points of the Strait of Hormuz. With the Arab allies now refusing to allow American jets to fly combat sorties from their soil, the United States military found its hands tied. The maximum pressure campaign had intended to starve Iran into submission, but instead, it had triggered a global energy crisis that threatened to bring the Western world to a grinding halt. The markets were no longer betting on a quick American victory. They were betting on a prolonged, agonizing conflict that the United States might not have the regional support to win. While Washington scrambled to formulate a response, the internal dynamics of the Iranian regime proved far more resilient than the Pentagon's war games had predicted. The decapitation strike had indeed killed the supreme leader, but it had also inadvertently triggered the Shadow State Protocol, a contingency plan designed during the height of the Iran-Iraq War. A collective leadership consisting of the most battle-hardened commanders of the Quds Force and the strategic masterminds of the Iranian intelligence services had taken control within 90 minutes. This new council did not waste time with mourning. They immediately launched a series of asymmetric responses that targeted not the American military directly, but the economic arteries of the world. Cyber attacks, sophisticated and relentless, began to blink out the power grids of several major European cities, while proxy forces in Yemen and Iraq received orders to activate their long-range drone swarms. The betrayal by the Arab ally was a calculated move born from a brutal assessment of American reliability. Having watched the chaotic withdrawals from Afghanistan and the shifting political winds in Washington, these regional powers decided that the United States was a volatile partner. They looked at the ruins of Tehran and saw not the end of a regime, but the beginning of a cycle of violence that would eventually leave their own glass skyscrapers and oil refineries in ashes. By reaching out to the new Iranian leadership, they were attempting to insulate themselves from the ring of fire that Iran had spent 40 years building around its neighbors. This was a survival instinct overriding a 75-year-old alliance. The United States now faced the terrifying prospect of being a superpower with no local base of operations, fighting a ghost war against an enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once, all while its supposed friends watched from the sidelines, waiting to see who would emerge from the fire. The silence that descended upon the White House Situation Room was not the silence of satisfaction, but the silence of a geopolitical catastrophe quietly taking shape. President Trump, who only hours earlier had hinted at a historic victory on social media, now had to stare at a high-level intelligence briefing that challenged every strategic prediction made by the Pentagon. The shock was absolute. Reports confirmed that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, a pillar of American influence in the Middle East for over 8 decades, had not only proactively contacted Tehran, but had also officially recognized the legitimacy of the newly formed Iranian Leadership Council. This was not a routine diplomatic check. It was a fundamental realignment of power that completely bypassed Washington. The United States found itself marginalized in a theater it once sought to dominate, as its most critical regional ally chose to navigate the aftermath of the decapitation strike through direct engagement with the enemy, rather than through the lens of the American alliance. This perceived betrayal was driven by a deep and practical fear. The Gulf leadership understood with cold sobriety that while the United States could unleash destructive blows from the air and return to the safety of the Atlantic, it was their own nations that sat within the immediate reach of Iran's vengeful ring of fire. Thousands of cruise missiles and swarms of advanced suicide drones remained positioned across the rugged Iranian highlands, their coordinates already locked onto the world's most vital oil processing facilities and desalination plants. Having observed the American withdrawal from Afghanistan and the shifting political priorities in Washington, these regional powers concluded that American security guarantees were no longer absolute. By initiating contact with the new leadership in Tehran, they were purchasing a form of survival insurance that Washington could no longer provide in a world of asymmetric warfare. Internal sources suggest that during the secret call, the Arab side proposed a regional security framework that excluded Western interference, effectively signaling that American bases on their soil would no longer be permitted to launch offensive sorties into Iranian territory. The shockwaves of this diplomatic earthquake were felt immediately in Tel Aviv, where Israeli officials watched their vision of a unified anti-Iran coalition evaporate. The prospect of fighting a multi-front war against a wounded and cornered Iran, while its Arab neighbors adopted a stance of neutrality or even tacit cooperation with the regime, was a strategic nightmare. Meanwhile, the global financial reaction was nothing short of a disaster. The Dow Jones Industrial Average plummeted by over 2,000 points in a single session as investors realized the era of predictable energy markets had vanished. With Iran maintaining its grip on the Strait of Hormuz and receiving the quiet support of regional silence, they held a metaphorical knife to the throat of the global economy. Washington's attempts to demand an explanation from Riyadh were met with calculated delays and cryptic statements, a clear sign that the traditional rules of Middle Eastern diplomacy had been incinerated. The new leadership in Tehran, a group of resilient and opportunistic figures who had survived the initial 50-second strike, exploited this opening with masterly precision. Instead of issuing immediate threats of mass retaliation, they broadcasted a message of regional solidarity, calling for a Middle East governed by its own people, free from the impositions of distant superpowers. This psychological blow resonated deeply with a regional public increasingly weary of Western military intervention. The United States realized too late that it was not just losing a kinetic war, but also the broader struggle for regional trust. This stab in the back was not just a diplomatic insult, it was a tearing of the fabric of the post-World War II order. As night fell on the fourth day of the conflict, the realization dawned that the battle for the future of the Middle East was no longer being decided by bunker-buster bombs in Tehran, but by the quiet conversations in Gulf palaces, where the American flag was becoming a symbol of a receding era. As the sun rose over the fourth day of the conflict, the logistical reality of the regional betrayal began to paralyze American operations with the cold efficiency of a physical blockade. For decades, the United States military presence in the Middle East had relied on a sprawling network of bases in countries like Qatar, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates, functioning as a seamless web of power projection. However, the stab in the back was not limited to a single phone call. It manifested as a systematic denial of airspace and basing rights that effectively turned these multi-billion-dollar installations into gilded cages for American hardware. Pilots found themselves grounded as local authorities cited maintenance issues or sovereignty concerns, preventing the very sorties intended to suppress Iranian missile batteries. The gears of the world's most powerful military machine began to grind with the friction of betrayal, leaving the Pentagon to realize that their high-tech arsenal was useless without the ground beneath it. The United States was becoming a giant without a footing, a superpower suddenly divorced from the geography it claimed to protect. In the streets of Tel Aviv and Haifa, the psychological toll of this isolation was devastating. With the Arab states signaling a move toward neutrality or secret non-aggression, the Israeli government realized it was facing the nightmare of a lone wolf war. The Iron Dome, once heralded as an impenetrable shield, was beginning to buckle under the sheer volume of a coordinated saturation attack. From the north, Hezbollah launched a barrage of precision-guided munitions that targeted the very power plants and water treatment facilities that kept the nation functioning. In the south, the Houthis in Yemen, emboldened by the shifting regional winds, fired long-range drones that bypassed traditional detection paths. The message from Tehran was clear: the American umbrella has holes, and you are standing in the rain. Israeli civilians, who had spent 72 hours in underground shelters, began to question the ultimate cost of the 50-second strike. If the goal was to bring peace through strength, the result was instead a landscape of fire and a feeling of profound abandonment. The Iranian response, meanwhile, shifted from chaotic retaliation to a calculated strategy of economic strangulation. The new leadership understood that they did not need to win a conventional dogfight against American F-35s. They only needed to keep the Strait of Hormuz closed long enough to trigger a global depression. In Washington, the political fallout was immediate and toxic. Critics of the administration pointed to the maximum pressure campaign as a failure of epic proportions, arguing that it had traded long-term stability for a short-term symbolic victory. The sight of lines at American gas stations, reminiscent of the 1970s energy crisis, began to erode the domestic support for the war. President Trump, facing a mounting crisis of confidence, was forced to confront the reality that his deal-making prowess had been outmaneuvered by a regime that had been preparing for this exact moment for 4 decades. The Arab allies were not just protecting themselves, they were testing the limits of American resolve, gambling that Washington would choose to withdraw rather than sink into a quagmire without local support. Behind the scenes, the shadow state in Tehran was already preparing its next move. They began leaking selective intelligence to international media, suggesting that the United States had used prohibited weapons or targeted purely civilian infrastructure during the initial strikes. This disinformation campaign, combined with the genuine humanitarian crisis unfolding in cities like Minab, began to turn global public opinion against the intervention. European leaders, already skeptical of the unilateral American action, started calling for an immediate ceasefire and a transition to a United Nations-led mediation process. The United States found itself increasingly isolated on the world stage, a pariah in the very region it sought to lead. The betrayal by the Arab nation was the catalyst that allowed the world to look away from Iran's provocations and focus entirely on American aggression. As the fourth day drew to a close, the strategic map of the Middle East had been redrawn in blood and ink, leaving Washington to face a terrifying truth. The war was no longer about a regime change in Iran, but about the survival of American influence in the 21st century. The hallways of the State Department and the Pentagon, usually buzzing with the calculated confidence of a superpower, were instead filled with the frantic energy of a house of cards beginning to collapse. The total shock that paralyzed Washington was not just a result of the military resistance from Iran, but the profound realization that the entire architecture of the Middle East, which the United States had meticulously built over 7 decades, had been fundamentally compromised. President Trump's vision of a grand bargain, where Arab nations and Israel would unite under an American banner to erase Iranian influence, had suffered a terminal blow. The very nations that had stood on the south lawn of the White House to sign historic peace agreements were now issuing joint statements with Tehran's new leadership, calling for the immediate withdrawal of all extra-regional forces. This was the ultimate geopolitical nightmare. The United States was being evicted from the Middle East, not by its enemies, but by the polite, firm requests of its supposed friends. The betrayal was rooted in a cold, hard assessment of the changing global order. For the Arab monarchies, the 52nd strike on Tehran had been a terrifying display of American power, but it had also been a display of American recklessness. They saw a Washington that was willing to decapitate a regional power without a clear plan for what came next, leaving its neighbors to deal with the radioactive fallout of a failed state and the scorched earth of a vengeful military. In the quiet majlis of Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, the decision was made that it was safer to appease a wounded lion at their doorstep than to rely on a hunter 3,000 miles away who might decide to go home at any moment. This pivot was underscored by a dramatic scene at the United Nations, where the Arab League, for the first time in history, refused to back a U.S.-sponsored resolution condemning Iranian retaliation, choosing instead to remain silent, a silence that spoke louder than any condemnation. Adding to the administration's woes was the unfolding humanitarian tragedy that the new Iranian leadership was broadcasting to every corner of the globe. Reports of an American airstrike hitting a girls' school in the southern city of Minab began to dominate the international news cycle. Despite the Pentagon's insistence that it only targeted high-value military assets, the images of grieving families in the dust of Minab became a potent weapon in the information war. This was the Afghanistan moment that the Trump administration had desperately tried to avoid. The narrative of liberation and democracy was being drowned out by the cries of occupation and aggression. Even within the United States, the consensus was fracturing. Prominent lawmakers, once supportive of a hardline stance, began to openly question if the country was being dragged into another forever war based on flawed intelligence and an overestimation of regional loyalty. The isolation of the United States reached a tipping point when the Arab ally in question officially closed its ports to the United States Navy's Fifth Fleet, citing the need to protect national sovereignty and prevent further escalation. This move effectively cut off the primary supply route for American forces operating in the Persian Gulf. In a single afternoon, the most powerful navy in the world found itself low on fuel and munitions, unable to dock in the very ports it had protected for generations. The shock in Washington turned into a scramble for a diplomatic exit ramp that didn't exist. President Trump, according to those close to him, felt personally insulted by the Arab leadership, viewing their actions as a betrayal of the personal rapport he had spent years building. But in the world of high-stakes geopolitics, personal rapport is a poor substitute for national survival. As the 5th day of the conflict began, the United States was no longer fighting a war to change Iran. It was fighting a desperate diplomatic battle to prevent the total evaporation of its prestige on the world stage. Realizing too late that the stab in the back had been sharpened by years of American overconfidence. The dust of the 52nd strike may have settled on the scorched earth of Tehran, but the geopolitical fallout has only just begun to reshape the world in ways Washington never anticipated. In the final hours of this unprecedented week, the United States finds itself at a crossroads that defines the limits of modern superpower influence. The total shock that rippled through the White House was not a result of a military defeat. On paper, the American and Israeli forces had achieved their objectives, eliminating the core leadership of the Islamic Republic and degrading its conventional capabilities. Yet, the victory feels hollow, even Pyrrhic. The stab in the back from the Arab ally was the final piece of evidence that the old world order, once governed by the singular gravity of Washington, has fractured beyond repair. The Middle East of tomorrow is not a region waiting to be liberated or managed by Western powers. It is a complex, multipolar arena where local survival and regional autonomy have become the new currency of diplomacy. President Trump's epic fury was intended to be a masterstroke of deterrence, a signal to the world that the United States would no longer tolerate threats to its interests or its allies. However, the unintended consequence was the acceleration of a regional alliance that excludes the West entirely. Reports now suggest that the Emergency Council in Tehran, far from being isolated, is in active discussions with major powers in the East to secure new trade and security guarantees. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz, once thought to be a suicidal move by Iran, has instead become a leverage point that the region is using to demand a seat at the table of global governance. The global economy, bruised and battered by the surge in energy prices, is now looking for stability anywhere it can find it, even if that means recognizing a regime that was supposed to be on the brink of collapse. The American dream of a new Middle East has been replaced by the reality of a managed Middle East, one where the United States is just one of many players and no longer the undisputed referee. As the sun sets on this historic week, the silence from the Arab palaces is the most telling sound of all. It is the sound of an era ending, the era of the American century in the desert. The betrayal was not a moment of sudden impulse, but the culmination of years of shifting trust and the cold calculation of national interest. For the people of Iran, the future remains uncertain and dangerous, but for the first time in 40 years, the narrative of their nation is being written in a context where Washington's voice is not the only one that matters. The United States must now grapple with the consequences of its own strength, realizing that in the 21st century, a surgical strike can remove a leader, but it cannot remove the deep-seated desire for regional self-determination. The shock in Washington is not just about a phone call or a closed port. It is the shock of realizing that the world has moved on and the old playbooks of power no longer apply. The final assessment of this conflict will not be written in the military annals of the Pentagon, but in the history books of the next generation. They will look back at the 52nd strike and the subsequent betrayal as the moment the pivot shifted. The United States remains a formidable military power, but the epic fury has shown that military might, without diplomatic cohesion, is a blunt instrument in a world of precision politics. As the last drones return to their bases and the diplomats retreat to their closed-door sessions, the stab in the back remains the defining metaphor for a relationship that was built on sand. The shock has passed, replaced by a grim new reality where the United States must earn its influence rather than demand it. This is the new Middle East, a place where alliances are fluid, silence is a strategy, and the most powerful nation on earth has learned at an incredible cost that true power is not found in the explosion but in the peace that follows it.